Everybody, welcome to the Bio 181 series of lectures discussing cell signaling and communication. We have focused a lot on general cell signaling as well as the processes that occur in animal cells. But in this lecture, we're going to focus on responses in plants. Are you surprised that I'm excited to talk to you about plants? Well, you should be. I am too. But here's a little secret. When it comes to my love of disease, I do not discriminate. Before I studied human infections, I actually studied plant infections. And in this lecture, I have the opportunity to tell you a little bit about how plant cells can respond to various environmental stimuli. And you guessed it, that includes their response to infection. As you are aware, I am not a plant biologist. However, I do find plant responsiveness fascinating. When I first learned about plant responsiveness, I naively was confused. Plants responding? They're actually super responsive to environmental stimuli in super fascinating ways. Although you are probably aware of observable responses such as the Venus flytrap snapping shut on a fly, that are also very responsive in less obvious ways. For example, they must respond to light and water in a way that allows them to seek out these resources as they are vital for their metabolism, photosynthesis. They only want to germinate and flower when these resources are abundant, so often seasonally. As well as this, not only animals have to worry about predation and infection, plants are just as susceptible to attack from predators as well as bacterial and viral infections. Thus, they must be able to detect these attacks and respond quickly in a way to protect themselves and their brethren. We've spent this week so far discussing cell signaling, and this is a good time to review. The process of cell communication in plants is the same as any other cell. Cell communication involves a cell receiving a stimulus and this stimulus eliciting a response. Stimuli are specific signals called ligands, which are small molecules or molecular patterns. Ligands are detected by specific receptors. These interactions are very specific, much like we have discussed with the active sites of enzymes being specific for a given substrate. For example, the active site of the enzyme lactase only binds to the sugar lactose. Similarly, cell receptors are specific for their ligand. Receptors are found all throughout cells. In plant cells, these can be located on the cell membrane, in the cytosol, on the nuclear membrane, in the nucleus, all over the place. This is important because this is how the cell receives messages, and it needs to be able to receive messages all throughout the cell. Once a stimulus or a ligand is detected by a receptor, a response takes place. The response to a stimulus is called the effector. Think of the ligand being the cause and the effector being the effect. If the direct response of a ligand binding a receptor is the necessary change or effect, this would be a direct response. This is pretty rare. It might be exemplified by a ligand binding a receptor and that receptor changing conformation to allow entrance of that ligand. For example, if the receptor is a channel protein. Most of the time, when a ligand binds a receptor, it signals a cascade of reactions called a signal transduction cascade. This is where multiple steps take place between the ligand binding the receptor and the effector response. Signal transduction is the mechanism that enables cells to receive extracellular signals via receptor-ligand binding and have these signals eventually result in an effector response, which usually involves genetic changes or changes to the DNA, basically turning genes on or off, which is essentially how a cell responds. Let's talk a little bit more about this process. Before we move on, just keep in mind that cell communication is essentially cells responding to their environment. It enables cells to detect environmental stimuli and respond to that stimuli as necessary. The stimuli are ligands, and these stimuli are detected by receptors. When a receptor detects a ligand, it elicits a response, which is called an effector response. Remember, it's the effect. So cells detect signals or ligands using receptors in order to be able to respond. This is a general diagram of this process. You have the receptor in green, the ligand in red, and a signal transduction cascade or pathway leading to an effector response. The molecules involved in a signal transduction cascade are called second messengers. The effector response can be many things. Functionally, enzymes can perform reactions, structural proteins can cause the cell to change shape or to move, and transcription factors can turn genes on or off. There are multiple benefits of signal transduction cascades or pathways. These enable one signal to lead to multiple responses, and these pathways enable multiple places to intervene or stop the process as necessary. Again, these are steps of general signal transduction, but these are translatable regardless of the cell you're considering. This slide is showing signal transduction specifically in plant cells, but you will notice that all of the same features are there. A variety of ligands can be detected by plant cell receptors, including physical stimuli such as light, water, chemical stimuli like hormones. Once these are detected by plant cell receptors, these messages are sent via second messengers to elicit an effector response, of which there are many. Alterations in gene expression, are genes being turned on or off, functional enzymes, or again, structural changes to the cell. In the next couple of slides, we're going to discuss some of the various stimuli that plants need to be able to respond to, as well as some specific examples of how plants respond to these stimuli. We can divide the signals plants need to respond to into two types of stimuli, physical and biological. Physical stimuli would include things like light or temperature or atmospheric gases. Physical barriers like rocks that their roots need to grow around, and more. Biological stimuli would include hormones or signaling chemicals, maybe produced by other plants to convey a message, or maybe even attack by predators or pathogens. Let's discuss some examples of the most common types of stimuli a plant might encounter, starting with physical stimuli. Plants respond to a variety of environmental physical stimuli as these factors are required for their primary metabolic process, photosynthesis. Light, carbon dioxide, and water are all absolutely required for photosynthesis, and therefore plants are very perceptive to these stimuli. Other factors impact plant access to these resources as well, such as needing to detect gravity and the presence of rocks and other barriers so that root systems can penetrate deep in the soil to access water and other minerals. In the next couple slides, we're going to look a little more closely at plant responses to two of these important stimuli, light and gravity. Light is an essential component to metabolism in most plants due to the role it plays in photosynthesis. As you can see in the equation for photosynthesis, light is one of the reactants, the energy of which is utilized to form bonds between carbons obtained from gases, carbon dioxide, and insert them into organic molecules. The output is glucose. This process is actually called carbon fixation, the process of creating organic molecules from inorganic molecules, and is a vital ecological process conducted by plants and other photosynthetic organisms. Because light plays such a vital role in plant metabolism, plants are very responsive to light, and many of their life cycles are depending on its presence. Plants actually have the ability to measure day length, for example, the amount of light hours per day, which can vary seasonally. The ability to sense and respond to day length is called photoperiodism, and the receptors that detect light are called photoreceptors. Some plants require abundant light. For example, plants that flower in summer, like lettuce or spinach or radishes, and these are called long day plants. Others require less, such as strawberries, potatoes, and soybeans, which flower in early spring and fall and are called short day plants. This also impacts when a plant's seeds will germinate, as they will only do so when nutrients are abundantly available. Some plants are considered day neutral plants because they require minimal light to grow. These actually include tomatoes and cucumbers. For these plants, growth requirements other than light determine their seasonality. Certain plants also prefer a certain amount of light. While most plants enjoy abundant light, some plants are considered shade plants and prefer less or indirect light. Photoreceptors and photoperiodism enable plants to move or grow toward areas that offer their preferred light. For example, you can see in this picture where this plant is growing toward the light emanating from the window. I think it's worth noting that photoreceptors are not restricted to plants. In fact, some form of photoreception is found in all domains of life. Photosynthetic and aquatic bacteria have photoreceptors that enable them to localize to areas where resources are prevalent, and the eye spots or formalize of an organism enable them to detect light and process this into visual information. Water and other nutrients that are vital for plant life are located deep in the soil in which plants grow. Thus, plants also have to have the ability to sense and respond to gravitational forces, a quality called gravitropism. This is exemplified by roots, which grow down or in the direction of gravity, exhibiting positive gravitropism, and shoots, or the body of the plant, exhibiting negative gravitropism, or growth in the opposite direction of gravity, basically towards the sun. The cells in a plant that allow detection and response to gravity are called stratocytes. These cells are rich in organelles called stratoliths, which are actually like plastids, like chloroplasts, but instead of containing light-absorbing pigment, they contain abundant starch. This makes them heavy, and the weight from accumulation of starch basically tells the plant the direction of gravity. Stratocytes are very responsive to gravity. In fact, if you knock a plant over, like seen in this picture, the shoots of the plant will change shape to enable them to grow upward, negative gravitropism, and the roots of the plant will actually change shape to grow downward, which is positive gravitropism. Plants similarly respond to touch via a variety of mechanisms. For example, if a root system encounters a physical barrier impacting their ability to exhibit positive gravitropism, the roots will actually grow around this physical barrier until they encounter soil or are able to grow downward as necessary. Some other examples of how plants respond to touch include vines, which produce tendrils and effectively reach out and wrap around objects to enable them to grow. Plants which stunt their growth due to heavy winds, which may lead them to breaking. And the trapping of prey by insectivorous plants. This also includes the responses of sensitive plants, like the mimosa plant, to touch. Plants like the mimosa plant are sensitive to touch as it allows them to protect themselves from herbivore attack. Let's check out a video of the mimosa plant, which is an excellent example of a sensitive plant. So I'm just gonna pull that up here. All right. me get this set up again. Okay. Okay, now that we have discussed some physical stimuli that plants respond to, let's switch gears to some biological stimuli that plants must respond to. Plants do need to respond to internal signals, much like our bodies are regulated by internal signals such as hormones and biological clocks, like the day and night cycle of the circadian rhythm. Plants have similar signals they sense and respond to. You might recognize the names of human hormones like estrogen or testosterone. Well, plants have hormones too, and two of the major plant hormones are called auxins and gibberellins. We're not going to go into depth about these specifically, so don't worry about memorizing these hormones. I just want to mention them so that you are aware that they exist. Importantly, plant hormones and other plant signaling molecules are able to travel and therefore transduce signals short distances like cell to cell through plasmodesmata in cell walls, or long distances through the plant vascular system, which is similar to the animal circulatory system. These chemicals enable plants to communicate with each other locally, but also enable plants to communicate organism-wide, for example, from the root to the tip. Plants also must respond to environmental stimuli. These include environmental chemical signals, such as those sent from neighboring plants or agricultural chemicals. They must also be able to detect attack. This might be in the form of physical damage, for example, if an herbivore is chomping on a plant's leaves, or infection. Yes, plants are just as susceptible to infection and disease as any other organism. In the next couple slides, we are going to elaborate on how plants respond to these attacks. An organism's means by which it protects itself is called its immunity. For example, your white blood cells provide immunity to infection by performing phagocytosis of many invading bacteria. All organisms have some mechanism of protecting themselves, including plants. Plants need to protect themselves against two primary predators: herbivores, or organisms that consume plants, and pathogens, organisms that cause disease, which are typically microbial organisms like bacteria or protists. Plants have numerous mechanisms of protecting themselves. These can include mechanical defenses like tough bark or waxy cuticle, thorns or spines, and trichomes, which are tiny hairs that are often coated in a sticky, poisonous substance, which is shown on the next slide here. These mechanical defenses are excellent at physically preventing attack from herbivores. Trichomes, for example, would catch herbivores in a sticky, poisonous solution and draw them nearer to microscopic spines. What a demise! Other plants have chemicals that cause a bad taste or are toxic to herbivores. Sometimes, in response to attack, a plant will produce a chemical that is able to become airborne, and this will either warn nearby plants of impending attack so they can start to produce preventative responses, or this can attract a predator of the herbivore that is trying to feed on the plant. This is the case for an organism called bodyguard wasps, which are attracted to plants when they produce a hormone in response to moths or caterpillars feeding on them. This study here actually just came out in July that attracting bodyguard wasps to agricultural crops may actually be a viable alternative to chemical pesticides. These plants produce hormones that are found to be robustly produced in certain strains of maize or corn. And the idea is to isolate the genes that lead to the production of these hormones and insert them into other agricultural organisms so they can too produce these anti-herbivore hormones. As again, this is a very new idea, but definitely has potential. So you can see here, this would be a caterpillar munching on this corn. The corn produces a hormone and it attracts the bodyguard wasp, which actually lays eggs in the caterpillar, and the caterpillar will not survive. Of course, as you know, I am a huge fan of disease. And that includes diseases of all organisms, including plants. Some of my background is in plant pathology, and I still have friends that are heavily involved in this field, like my best friend. So I do want to briefly discuss how plants can respond to infection, because it is interesting and a great way to learn about cell signaling. First, it's important to note some terms. As mentioned earlier, organisms that cause disease are called pathogens. In order to infect a plant, pathogens must create molecules called elicitors. These are ligands, or molecules that bind to plant receptors and enable the pathogen to establish an infection and cause disease. Plants do actually have specific receptors that detect pathogens, and these are appropriately called pathogen or pattern recognition receptors. Recall from our talks that ligands bind to receptors and elicit a response. In this case, the pathogen is the ligand, the pathogen recognition receptor is the receptor, and how the plant responds to infection is the response. This is just a really good diagram of how cells respond to pathogen attack via pathogen recognition receptors. To orient you, the plant is shown in green. You can see the plasma membrane, that's PM, as well as the cell wall, which is CW. You can see that the plant's pathogen recognition receptors, or PRRs, as well as the pathogen, with numerous molecules that serve as elicitors, or ligands, that bind to the plant's pattern recognition receptors and therefore stimulate the plant's response to attack. The pathogen we're looking at here specifically is a bacterium called Pectobacterium, which is a common plant pathogen that can devastate agricultural crops. So you can see what it has done here to this head of cabbage. What happens is Pectobacterium creates elicitors that are toxic, and this can lead to the death of this plant cell, which is what those brown spots are. They're dead cells. However, plants have adapted several pathogen recognition receptors that are able to detect the presence of this pathogen before it causes damage. If these receptors detect the pathogen, it will initiate a signal transduction cascade that will initiate a defense response. Some examples include the production of antibacterial compounds, and others include the production of inflammation. Yes, inflammation. Let's look closer at that. As a human, you experience inflammation as pain, swelling, heat, and redness. Think about what happens if you get an infection or a wound. You feel these things. We don't necessarily know if plants feel pain, but we do know that they respond to an infection and injury with inflammation. This would be in response to the plant pathogen receptors detecting the pathogen's elicitors. It would be the response to signal transduction. The plant's response to detecting the pathogen is to generate some chemical defenses. This can include reactive oxygen species like hydrogen peroxide and nitric oxide. These chemicals are pretty great at fighting pathogens. They can kill the pathogen directly. They can strengthen cell walls in an effort to prevent pathogen entry into the cytoplasm. They can trigger additional genetic responses that would lead to the production of antibacterial molecules, and they can also induce plant cell death, which might seem a little counterintuitive, like why would a plant cell induce its own death in response to a pathogen? Let's take a closer look. To orient you to this figure, you are looking at a plant tissue. In other words, several plant cells joined together. You can see here an enlarged image of what is happening to this cell in particular. It's being attacked by a pathogen. The pathogen has elicitors that bind to the plant's pathogen recognition receptors. The plant's response, as you can see, is to produce antibacterial compounds such as nitric oxide and hydrogen peroxide. As mentioned, these do protect the plant by killing pathogens directly or strengthening cell walls, as well as producing defense compounds and hormones. However, as you can see here, these compounds can also lead to plant cell death. So why would they do this? Well, it actually makes sense if you consider that the entire reason that the pathogen is attacking their host in the first place is for nutrients. Just like you eat Brussels sprouts for nutrition, bacteria do too. Since bacteria are so small, they actually attack individual plant cells. So if the plant is trying to kill one of the cells in its tissue, it would basically be cutting off the nutrient supply to the pathogen. So if nutrients are cut off, the pathogen can't reproduce. So in effect, if the plant kills a cell, it's cutting off the pathogen's nutrient supply and therefore preventing the pathogen from establishing an infection. If you've ever observed necrotic spots on a plant, so they're shown here on this leaf, a little closer up here on this leaf, this is what the plant is doing, essentially just killing random cells in the tissue, cells that have been exposed to pathogen, so that they can limit the spread of the pathogen through the tissue. I do want to end on a happy note. Not all infections are bad. Just like you have a normal or healthy microbiome, plants do too. When two organisms have a mutually beneficial relationship, they are said to exhibit symbiosis. An example of this is when plant roots are infected with a fungal microorganism. This is called a mycorrhizae. Fungi tend to be able to absorb nutrients very efficiently, and are also very, very small and can spread really well through densely packed soil, which can sometimes be difficult to access for some root systems. So when root systems have symbiotic mycorrhizae, the symbiotic fungi help to obtain difficult to reach nutrients from the soil, and in turn are provided with sugars from the plants and their photosynthesis. So you can see a plant with normal mycorrhizal fungi has larger root systems as well as grew larger compared to an organism without that symbiotic fungi. This lecture was primarily meant to expose you to some of the methods that plants use to respond to their environment, with the hope that it can solidify your understanding of cell signaling and communication. From this lecture, we hope that you're able to understand how environmental stimuli are detected by cells, that you understand how environmental messages elicit a cellular response, that you understand the various stimuli that plants need to be able to respond to, that you understand how plants respond to light and gravity and attack generally. You need to know the terms cell communication, ligands, receptors, second messengers, signal transduction, effector response. From this lecture in particular, know the terms photoperiodism, photoreceptors, gravitropism, stratocytes, positive and negative gravitropism, circadian rhythm, immunity, pathogen or pattern recognition receptor, necrotic spot, symbiosis, and mycorrhizae. We hope you enjoyed Jamie and I's series on cell signaling and cell communication. Thank you for putting the effort into listening to these lectures. We are very happy to have you in this class.